Call the meeting of the Minot City Council to order for today, Tuesday, February 19th, 2019. Appreciate everyone coming out for attendance, not only in chambers, but also watching us streaming live. I would ask that anyone who has a cell phone or electronic device to make sure that they're on silent or on vibrate so we can keep the disruptions down to a minimum. Roll call, please.
Janser.
Here.
Olson. Here. Pittner.
Here.
Pajagula.
Here.
Straight. Wolski.
Here.
Sitma.
Here. Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Number 3 on our agenda this evening is personal appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone to come and speak on any item that is not on our agenda this evening. So if there's something that you want to talk about that doesn't appear on our agenda this evening, please, this is your opportunity to come forward to the microphone and say your name and address, and we'll be more than happy to hear what you have to say. One last call for personal appearances. Seeing none, we'll move to number 4, public hearing.
Ordinance number 5320, rezone Northdale 3rd Edition, Lot 3 and 4, from C2 to RM. It's a public hearing to consider ordinance number 5320 on second reading to rezone Northdale 3rd Edition, Lot 3 and 4, from C2 to RM.
So once again, this is a public hearing for anyone to speak for or against the ordinance rezone for Northdale 3rd Edition this evening. Anyone to speak on the public hearing? If not, I would entertain a motion. Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I move we close the public hearing and approve the item.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson. Any discussion on the motion? Yes, Alderman Wolski.
Mayor, just a brief comment here. These seem to be approved on, or we're having the public hearing on second reading tonight, which may be a little departure from past procedure. If we do this in the future, I think it would be helpful to have the supporting information attached to the first reading as a part of our agenda. I don't have any problem doing this because I think this is pretty standard stuff, but it's just helpful to have information other than just an ordinance and a legal description of what we're dealing with. So.
We can ask the staff to just attach that with our agendas as they're posted. Yes, thank you, Alderman Wolski. Any further discussion? Further discussion? Call the roll.
Janser.
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Pittner.
Yes.
Pajagula.
Yes.
Wolski.
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to number 4.2, another ordinance reading.
Ordinance 5346, change the zone from C2 to M1 on Bridgeview Park Edition, Lot 1. Public hearing to consider ordinance number 5346 on second reading to rezone Bridgeview Park Edition, Lot 1, from C2 to M1.
Once again, a public hearing. Anyone who wishes to speak for or against it, this is an opportunity to come forward. One last call for comments on the public hearing. If not, I would entertain a motion from the council. Alderman Olson.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we close the public hearing and move the item.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Olson, second by Alderman Janser. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion on the motion. Call the roll.
Olson.
Yes.
Pittner.
Yes.
Pajagula.
Yes.
Wolski.
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Motion is approved. We have one more public hearing this evening.
Ordinance number 5349, change the zone from C2 to M1 on Lafarge Edition Block 2. A public hearing to consider ordinance number 5349 on second reading to change the zone on Lafarge Edition Block 2 from C2 to M1.
As before, a public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak for or against the item before us for the rezoning from C2 to M1 on the Lafarge Edition Block 2? Anyone wishing to comment? Motion from the council. Alderman Pittner.
Mayor, I move that we close public hearing and approve the item.
Motion by Alderman Pittner, second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Dancer,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion is approved. Number 5 is Mayor's Proclamation. I do apologize this evening to the folks in attendance. I'm now going to start making an effort to come down to present proclamations, but seeing as I have severely injured my back, I'm going to stay seated this evening. So the City of Minot proclaimed February 17th through the 23rd as Engineers Week, whereas engineers use their scientific and technical knowledge and skills in creative and innovative ways to fulfill society's needs, and whereas engineers face the major technical challenges of our time, from rebuilding cities after being devastated by natural disasters, cleaning up the environment, and assuring safe, sustainable, and cost-effective infrastructure is designed and constructed to meet the needs of society. And whereas engineers are encouraging our young math and science students to realize their practical power of knowledge, and whereas we will look more than ever to engineers and their knowledge and skills to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, therefore, do I, Sean Sitma, Mayor of Minot, hereby proclaim February 17th through the 23rd, 2019, as Engineers Week in Minot in recognition of the important past work and future contributions provided by the engineers within our community and their vital role in creating safe, reliable infrastructure for the City of Minot and its residents. Signed, Sean Sitma, today, February the 19th, 2019. Again, we want to extend all of our thanks to the engineers and the future engineers who may be listening at home, I'm sure intently. Number 6 on our agenda is consider the report of the Magic Funds Screening Committee. I believe Mr. Jason Zimmerman is with us this evening to answer any questions that we have on the annual compliance report.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. In your packet was the 2018 annual compliance report from the Magic Funds Screening Committee. As we do annually, it's for your review, but I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Any questions, Alderman Wolski?
Mayor Sitma, thanks. Mr. Zimmerman, appreciate the attention to detail that delivers this document to us on an annual basis. Not a lot of activity in the Magic Fund over the past year or so, but very hopeful with some changes to some economic development practices that we're going to be able to better utilize that resource. So I hope we see you here more often in the future.
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Wolski, I do too. I've actually had to dig back into the guidelines a little bit every now and then just to refresh the memory, because it has been, and there has been some challenging times going on, and I think you know, there's some good things that could be in our near future, and hopefully they come to fruition and we can utilize the Magic Fund accordingly.
Any further questions for Mr. Zimmerman tonight? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Number 7 is our consent agenda items. I have been asked to pull 7.3 and 7.5, 7.7 and 7.8. Is there any other items the aldermen wish to pull, or anyone from the audience on our agenda, consent agenda items?
I wanted to confirm item 7.7 has been pulled. It's the wheel loader.
Yes.
Okay.
So our consent items, we'd be looking for a motion on 7.1, 7.2, 7.4. Did I say 7.5? Okay. 7.5, 7.6 for our consent.
I'm sorry.
You wanted 7.
7.5 was pulled, okay.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move the consent on the remaining items.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson on consent on the remaining items. Further, any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes, motion is approved. 7.3 is the gaming site authorization for the Northcote Association for the Disabled Incorporated.
Move approval.
Motion to approve by Alderman Olson.
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. And I believe we have someone here to speak on the issue. While you're at the podium, sir, maybe just for our information's sake with the North Dakota Association for the Disabled, a little bit of what you guys do for the community.
We run programs to help people with disabilities across the state. We're a statewide charity. We've been in existence here in the city of Lima for over 30 years. Our office is in the Jacob Rabbit building next to the Shots Crossroads truck stop. We do everything from
Oh, there we go. All right, we do everything from equipment loans to help with medical travel, help with anything else that falls through the cracks that anyone needs along the way.
Thank you, sir. One more time, I don't think we had your microphone on, so we
Okay.
have it on record. Name and association there.
My name is Byron Newnam, and I'm the gaming director here for ND80 in the city of Minot.
Perfect. Now we got you recorded. Thank you.
No problem.
Any questions? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, I don't have any questions for Mr., is it Noonan?
Newnam.
Newnam, okay.
sir.
I do have some comments associated with this item.
Thank you. Appreciate being here this evening. Alderman Wolski.
Yeah, Mayor Sitma, thank you. Prior to tonight's meeting, I left a memo in front of each of you up here, and I'm, at this point in time, not supportive of this particular agenda item. It has nothing to do with Mr. Newnam and his organization here. It is more to do with, I think we're at a point as the city of Minot where we want to maybe step back and take a look at how we have been permitting these particular activities in the past. It's been my observation that many of these approvals kind of go through maybe what I would consider a rubber stamp process. They very rarely get discussion. They very rarely get consideration as to whether we in the community are getting the full mileage that we might be getting out of allowing these activities. And so in light of what I consider a collision of circumstances, I think it might be appropriate to take a step back from providing the approvals to these and take a closer look at our policy to ensure that we're getting as much as we can out of the allowance of this activity. A couple things that have hit my attention. One is the recommendations from our IEDC technical teams that are recommending we take a larger look at our holistic liquor licensing plan. Not every gaming permit is attached to a liquor establishment, but I would say a majority of them are. And as we get to a circumstance whereby we may want to contemplate removing the cap on our full retail liquor license, I think we're going to also want to explore ideas whereby we can provide value back to those license holders. And I think attaching gaming, perhaps the exclusivity of gaming to these particular license types is an area that we want to remain open to us. And as this particular application is for operation of gaming within a supper club, I believe we're extending a condition in terms of the way we're operating that we may want to backtrack from. So for that reason, I'm inclined to want to slow this application down and not add gaming into any additional supper clubs, because it is not a practice that is very common right now, and I don't want to continue that practice until we've evaluated this holistically with regards to where this might fit in terms of the liquor license. I've also noticed what I think is a larger concern, maybe even culturally, with regards to the practice of gaming and the merger of gaming operations with food and beverage operations. We approved a transfer of a liquor license not too many months back, whereby the gaming operator and the food and beverage operator were very closely tied. And I think this creates a environment that, while I do not suspect we're going to deal with it in this instance, I think there is an environment whereby the circumstances are ripe for behavior that turns the food and beverage side into a loss leader for the gaming side. When you have the two operators that are very closely tied in the same building, you can essentially price your food and beverage operation at a level that drives people in the door because there's revenue to be earned from the gaming side of things. And if we have a policy that doesn't acknowledge this, I think we're creating a circumstance that's ripe for future trouble and concerns from other operators. And then as I look at the concerns about a community with many needs and many resources, I want to ensure that as we are approving gaming sites, that perhaps we're being thoughtful about what we want to achieve in the community and making sure that our goals, if possible or if appropriate, and I think this would require a lot of input from our staff and our attorneys and the manner and items which we have the authority to do and don't have the authority to do, but to make sure that perhaps these gaming operations should be in alignment with some of our larger community goals. You know, one of the comments I hear on a regular basis is, when are we going to put the community facilities tax back in place in terms of being able to deliver money and resources into the community for some of these wish list items, let's put them that way. And I do not see a very rosy future for us being able to attach sales tax to those activities. We've got too many other pressing obligations. But that doesn't change the need in the community for some of these types of facilities and resources. Maybe if we are more thoughtful about how we approve these gaming sites, they can help us assist in achieving some of those goals. So with those in mind, if we get to a vote on this, I am not going to be supportive of this particular agenda item. But in light of those concerns, I would offer a motion to table this item until such time as staff has had time to review some of these concerns, review the larger authorities that are granted to us underneath the state law in terms of telling us what we do have the authority to do, what we do not have the authority to do. If we have the opportunity to be more particular in terms of crafting this policy, I would like to know about that before we approve these items. So that is a motion to table until such time we've gathered a little more information.
Under parliamentary procedure, the motion to table does supersede the previous motion
If it's seconded.
if there's a second. City Manager Barry.
Yeah, there has to be a.
Is there a second? Is there a second before we make any comments on the motion to table?
I'll second so we can talk about it.
Second by Alderman Patergula. City Manager Barry, you had a comment.
Just a quick comment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just for the council's education about this, you're free to decide what you want to do on this. I would just give you this advice. This applicant is vested under the city's existing policies and ordinances. So I think that you would find yourself in legal jeopardy. We can ask our city attorney for that analysis. But because this project is already, the application has already been made, and we are evaluating its efficacy, if you will, against existing policy, my recommendation is that you make a decision on this one based on that. And if you should decide to take Alderman Wolski's advice and have the staff study this more and that sort of stuff, that can be done, you know, going forward at some point in time. But I'd highly caution you tabling or not acting on this unless you feel the specific information about the application or the applicant is missing.
Alderman Patergula.
Yeah, I just, regardless of legal considerations, I don't feel comfortable. It's as if we're holding this particular hostage for this particular organization and its request hostage in a sense. I like Josh's idea of stepping back and taking a look at this, but I don't think they should be tied together. So I'll oppose the motion to table.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to echo Alderman Patergula's comments. I agree with Alderman Wolski that I think this is a worthwhile thing, taking a step back and looking. But again, this applicant is under the current structure that we have. I think it's unfair to kind of use them as the sacrificial lamb or the example, I guess, in this case. So I wouldn't feel comfortable tabling this issue, but I do agree, and maybe a motion by Alderman Wolski to further look into this would be something worth looking into.
Further comments on the motion to table? Any further comments on the motion to table? Please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
No.
Janser?
No.
Olson?
No.
Pittner?
No.
Padragula?
No.
Motion fails. Back to the original motion to approve the application for the gaming site authorization. I would just maybe echo, but even further, the comments here regarding this application, regarding the charitable gaming and what the charitable contributions have been to the community by a number of these different entities. To Alderman Wolski's comments within the IEDC report, there very well could be some substantial research done by some of these technical teams to further that discussion. Not too long ago, an ad hoc committee actually went through and did a complete review on our complete liquor license and did make some substantial changes in terms of the time frame for which the reassessment for the number of liquor licenses that are available. And of course, that benchmark was 2020 coming up for the next census. And after that, it was each year on the estimated census. Not to say that the city can't review those ordinances, but for reference that it was just a couple of years ago. I will support the approval of this, and perhaps if Alderman Wolski wants to work with the technical team or further develop a fully planned idea to bring back. At this time, I don't feel that an ad hoc committee is quite relevant until further information is maybe brought forward, but certainly can explore that. Further discussion on the motion to approve. Further discussion. Call the roll.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Wolski?
Nope.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion approved. Takes us to 7.5, to pledge assets December 31st, 2018.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move the item.
Motion to approve by Alderman Janser,
Second.
second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the item. Alderman Wolski.
I would simply just request Mr. Lakefield give us kind of a layman's terms review of what we're looking at here.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is a requirement provided for under state statute. And what this does is it provides protection for funds that are held in deposit institutions that exceed the FDIC insurance levels. So state law requires that those institutions either provide a bond or they can pledge securities that equal 110% of the funds held at the institution. It also provides for a mechanism for deposit placement services. That's a recent change, and that is something that the city is looking into with some of its banking partners.
Thank you, City Finance Director Lakefield. Any further questions? Thank you, sir. Further discussion on the motion? Please call the roll.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes. Motion is approved. 7.7 on our agenda is the industrial wheel loader project number 4412.
Mr. Mayor,
Alderman Janser.
I'd move the item.
Second.
Motion to approve by Alderman Janser and second by Alderman Pittner. And for clarification, taking the city's recommendation for the bid to RDO for the bid amount of $44,343 for the 5-year lease. Discussion. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. I am very curious as to the thoughts of my fellow aldermen and you, Mr. Mayor, on this. I look at this particular bid package and I have to admit that I am very intrigued by a 5-year lease payment of $26,000 and potentially not purchasing the equipment at the end of that period. On that particular avenue, it appears to me that we save almost $18,000 a year. We have a total cost on this particular piece of equipment of $120-some thousand versus $220-some thousand. To me, I think that might be a more prudent way to spend dollars at this particular point, is not obligating us to any more than we need to be obligated. So I would appreciate other aldermen's thoughts on this. I think for this particular recommendation, I'm going to be opposing this item as proposed.
I think for this one, perhaps we should bring up our Public Works Director or even our Finance Director, Jason perhaps, on the recommendation for the higher upfront lease payment with a buyout of $1 at the end. Jason, could you hit the button there for me? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, so every year when we go into budget, we're obviously trying to be good stewards of the city's money. And when we have big, large capital items like this, we had a loader in the budget last year, we had a loader in the budget this year. So trying to get the equipment we need in the period of time we needed it, this is the avenue that we budgeted for. So there's $40,000 in the 2019 budget for the lease of this machine. So, this is the one that we bid last month, and now this is the one that we're bringing back to you.
Questions for our Assistant Public Works Director?
Mr. Mayor.
Alderman Janser.
So at the end of 5 years, you've got, how many hours on this thing, on this loader? Do we want to keep it?
With this piece of machinery, definitely. We probably put about 700 or 800 hours a year on this piece of equipment. So, after 5 years, it'll have, 3,500, 4,000 hours on it. It's not like our landfill equipment where we know it's in one of the harshest environments that we can put this piece of machinery. It's had, normal day-to-day use. So this would definitely be a very appealing piece of equipment to buy after the 5-year.
Okay. Further questions for Jason? Alderman Wolski.
Jason, do we have multiple loaders for the street department? So would we be in a situation whereby, in terms of, programming our equipment, we would have one for a lease period of 5 years that we used, and we have one existing that we might be able to save for a period of time? I'm not sure if that's a viable operational methodology or not. I just offer it out there because, again, as I look at the $18,000 savings, I'm attracted to it.
So, Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, so yeah, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. This piece of equipment, I definitely wouldn't want to turn back. It has more value than what that buyout is worth. So I think this is a piece of machinery that we definitely want to buy back. I have no problem, just writing a check for it for $204,000 as well. I don't know that I have reserves in that department to do that, but. So right now in our street department, to answer your question, we have two very old, aged loaders. They both have upwards of about 15,000 hours on them. So, those are going to get, either relocated to another department where they're going to be lightly used, or they're going to be put back as a secondary unit. So we ended up with these. We leased a machine last year, and now this is another one for 2019.
Further questions for Assistant Public Works Director? Alderman Patrugula.
Thank you. Just to clarify, so you're saying that the intent would be to keep it for how many years? At least 5, right?
Yeah, Mayor Sedma, Alderman Patrugula. So it's a 5-year lease with a buyout. So the options would be to pay the lease payments and give it back, or pay the lease payments and buy it out.
I guess I wasn't clear, I'm sorry. So obviously you'd want to keep it. How long of a lifespan do you expect it to have?
The two that we have in our department now are from the, mid to late 90s machines, so 15, 20 years, obviously not knowing what kind of shape it'll be in after 10, maybe, with these leases, we kind of have an out, every now and again, some of this equipment can, you get a lemon or something. So we have an out where we can get rid of it earlier.
If I'm understanding correctly, I just want to be clear about this. I'm not into numbers very much, or these kinds of numbers at least. In the long term, over the 5 to 10 type 5-year time span, the one you're recommending, that purchase would be cheaper for us.
Correct. I think it's about $6,000 cheaper than the second bidder
Okay.
over the course of the 5 years plus the buyout.
And after the 5 years, it's ours for free.
Yep.
Thanks.
Further questions for our Assistant Public Works Director? If not, I see our finance, thank you, Jason. Our Finance Director, Mr. Lakefield, is coming up.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the way the specification was in this bid item, it was for either the lowest base bid price for the straight purchase or the total of all lease payments and the buyout. So in this case, the way the specification was, we can either purchase the loader up front or we take into consideration the total of the lease payments and the buyout to terminate the lease at lease end.
Thank you,
Just to clarify.
Alderman Wolski.
So, Mr. Lakefield, in essence, we do not have the option to walk away from the lease based on the bid specs that we wrote.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, this was the specification for awarding the bid. The option would still be there if for some reason that equipment we didn't feel had the value that that lease end would be, the buyout at lease end. I would say the option was still there, but the specification for awarding the bid, the way it was published, is either for the purchase up front or the total cost, including the lease payments and the buyout.
Further questions for our Finance Director? Thank you, sir. Further comments on the motion? Any further discussion? Please call the roll, Kelly.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
No.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to 7.8, the retail beer and wine license for LS Teca, LLC, DBA LS Teca.
Move the item.
Motion to approve by Alderman Wolski, second by Alderman Janser. Discussion. Alderman Wolski.
Brief point of discussion here, Mr. Mayor, again, just sort of pointing to some liquor license issues. Historically, I think we have probably issued what would be specialty wine and specialty beer licenses to these types of operations, food-based operations. But it seems there have been some changes that result in the fact that we can now just issue a retail beer and wine license. It only illustrates the fact that we have some redundancy and some duplication in our current ordinance. And so, again, I think I just pointed out as reason to maybe consider continual looking at liquor licenses, which I am doing, and I will be bringing some proposals, but I just wanted to call attention to it.
Thank you, Alderman Wolski. Further discussion on the motion? Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to Section 8, our action items. 8.1 is the Apple Air sublease agreement.
Move approval.
Motion by Alderman Olson.
Second.
Second by Alderman Pittner. Discussion on the item. Any discussion on the item? Please call the roll.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Motion is approved. 8.2 on our agenda is the amendment to the ordinance 2361 to provide an exemption to prohibition on discharging firearms within the city limits. For the folks listening at home, the Minot International Airport, located within the city limits, the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan, which has been reviewed and approved by the Federal Aviation Administration, contemplates the airport being able to use firearms to carry out wildlife control duties at the airport.
So moved.
Moved
Second.
by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Wolski. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Oh, Alderman Wolski.
I'll just share that I think this is, maybe somewhat attached to some of the conversations we had last fall regarding wildlife management and nuisance animals. This is clearly a place where wildlife and airports and airplanes do not mix. So I think this is an easy one to support.
Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. 8.3, the City Council approve of the 22-month MADC agreement.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Pittner,
Second.
second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the item. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, I'm going to just share some brief comments. Reading through this contract, I think we're on the whole getting to, I think, a much better arrangement, a much more accountable arrangement with MADC. I initially had some concerns that the timeframes for a couple of these deliverables were maybe a little further out than I would have preferred to see them in terms of the first list of items in June of 2019, and then the larger comprehensive economic plan in June of 2020. I was kind of hoping to see some of that moving forward, but in conversations on the front of this meeting, I think I'm comfortable approving this as is tonight.
Any further discussion on the motion? Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion is approved. 8.4 is our artificial turf. In the fall of 2018, Tim Valley met with the city staff to discuss the installation of the artificial turf at the newly constructed Valley Sport and Marine Building located at 2125 Elk Drive in Minot. Chapter 24.3 of the zoning code subsection F1 prohibits the use of artificial trees, shrubs, plants, or turf to fulfill the minimum requirements for landscaping. Based on the information received, city staff cannot identify an exemption in the zoning ordinance that would allow Mr. Valley to use the artificial turf in lieu of the organic landscaping material. Before us this evening is 5 different options to consider for a motion this evening on how to proceed regarding our artificial turf. I need to entertain a motion before discussion.
Mr. Mayor,
Alderman Janser.
would move option 1 to direct the city staff to draft an amendment to the zoning ordinance to allow installation of artificial turf in the city of Minot.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the motion. Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I make this motion, I think, in recognition of the fact that we need to keep up with current trends, technology, and available options. And, you know, there are instances where having growing grass is a great option. And then there are other circumstances where having a, high-quality artificial turf really makes life easier and is the answer. And so for that reason, I think we need to include this among the options that we have available to our citizens.
Further discussion, Alderman Padragula.
I like the idea of flexibility, particularly when we're trying to make it easier for people to develop buildings and businesses. The way the world is changing, the way the climate is changing, the crazier things get. I don't like the idea of having more runoff. I think we need to do everything we can, whether it's a lot, whether it's a boulevard or whatever, to try to allow rain, which there'll be more of in larger quantities and more abrupt quantities, to drain off. I keep thinking of also on philosophical grounds, I guess, besides climatological grounds. I'm not keen on artificial turf surfaces. I keep thinking of that Joni Mitchell song where one of the lyrics is, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Sorry, I'm not going to support this.
Further discussion, Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. Oddly enough, in a past life, I sold this product for several years. So I'm very familiar with it. And I think Alderman Padragula brings up a notable point in terms of runoff. The manufacturers will claim up and down that this is a permeable product and it takes water to the same degree, but in my experience, it does create additional runoff. At the same time, Alderman Janser makes a good point. There are areas where where this is a natural alternative. One place would be dog runs in particular shady parts of yards where you have animals, and it's a very practical product in situations like this. And I think also, you know, in the case that's before us tonight, in terms of some of these narrow boulevard areas, it's a reasonable and practical product. So I think I'm going to support this agenda item tonight. I do have a couple concerns. One is that just procedurally, I think we're jumping the gun a little bit. And Mr. Lang, maybe, I don't know if we took this up at our zoning and planning steering or if there was a recommendation from there, but as this is, I think, an adjustment to a zoning and planning ordinance, at the very least, it's appropriate to have this in front of them or give that board sort of a heads up, because they've been meeting very diligently and working hard to address the challenges in the ordinance. I think the proof will be in the pudding here when we get to the actual ordinance that we see, because I think that will be the area where I'm most likely to reconsider my position.
We have our principal planner, Mr. Lance Lang, with us. Lance, could you hit the little button on top so we can all hear you? Yeah. Perfect. There you go.
Is it on now?
There you go.
Okay. Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, there are 5 options here, and so uncertain as to which direction the council might go. So with picking number 1, to direct staff to draft an amendment to the ordinance, I think through that process it would go to the zoning ordinance steering committee once we get to the level we think it's ready to take it there. I think logically, if one of the other choices were to create a pilot program or one of the other things, then maybe the zoning ordinance steering committee would not be a part of that. But I think it's logical to be assured that that'll happen.
I agree, Lance. I appreciate that perspective too, because I think you're right. There's still much opportunity for that to be in front of them.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Lang, I have no doubt that this would be under consideration, but to be considered, as both Alderman Wolski and Padrigula pointed out, water mitigation plans and then replacement mitigation plans if it were damaged and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity to take a good look at this. So I'm comfortable with where we're at through the process. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, one question for Mr. Lang. Lance, this is obviously an attractive product, and I know all the reasons why. One, it is low maintenance, all these types of things. Are there other provisions inside of our zoning and planning ordinance that might be prohibiting other low-maintenance natural products that do not amount to resorting to artificial turf? I think of things like ornamental grasses or native grasses, where we might have a provision that requires grass be kept at a certain length that just makes additional difficulties or closes doors on other options that might have been available in this situation.
From a nuisance perspective, Alderman Wolski, excuse me, from a nuisance perspective, we talk about the height of grass not being a certain, getting to a certain height that has to be mowed, but that would be turf grass and weeds and that kind of thing. Ornamental grasses that are planted in a landscape setting, I think, need to be considered in a different light. The perennials and the grasses you see in planting beds are not the same situation where you'd have a lot that was overgrown with tall grasses, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Alderman Janser.
I guess, and maybe this is sort of a secondary question, but can somebody tell me, so these discussions with Mr. Valley were held in the fall of 2018. So what are his options, or what is his situation while we try to draft this ordinance and figure out, where we're going with this?
Alderman Janser, when we met with Mr. Valley in the fall, that was the first that he'd mentioned the artificial turf, and at that time, winter was closing in, and he was hustling to get his landscaping done, and the window closed before he could pursue artificial grass. So that gave us the off season here, and our goal was to to bring this before the council to get some direction. So if your directive was to pursue this, that we could try to get something in place. So when Mr. Vallely's ready, when I'd say maybe in May or so, when the timing's right, that there will be some rules in place that that he could follow to pursue the artificial turf at his location.
Okay, thank you.
I like that optimism of May.
Well, I didn't want to say April.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't have a question for Mr. Lang, but just to provide some perspective and maybe some insight, I guess. And since Alderman Straight isn't here, I know it's a site that we reference a lot as the gathering space, and the gathering space actually in Rapid City, they implement artificial turf, and it is low to no maintenance. It is well maintained. I mean, I think there's an opportunity here to look at this ordinance for future implementation, not only in the private sector, but also in some of our instances with future maintenance and flood control and sites that we're gathering and projects that we're undertaking. I think this ordinance is an opportunity and can be looked at that. So just my thoughts.
Any further questions for Principal Planner? City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have questions for Mr. Lang, but I just wanted to get some clarification, particularly from Alderman Janser in the motion. Alderman Janser, are you willing to allow the staff to explore the flexibility of this potential ordinance change? Because there may be some opportunities or some locations or times or places that we wouldn't necessarily want artificial turf. So your motion was very specific to sort of to the number one option, which was a sort of carte blanche allowance, and I'd say that may not be the best for the city as we study this and move through the ordinance development process. Do we have flexibility to identify locations or times or those sorts of things where it might not be appropriate?
I certainly think so. That, to me, that's part of the crafting of the ordinance, is to, make it something that is sensible and that, would give guidance and perhaps also in some circumstances prohibition. So, yes.
Excellent.
And that, with the second, was the intent?
Thank you very much.
Alderman Patergula.
That kind of sounds like option 2. And that's, I guess, to be candid with you, I'd be willing to support option 2. I'm not willing to support a blanket authorization for turf, artificial turf. I think one of the ways I might be placated, for example, would be if we take the case of wetlands. We allow people to pave over and otherwise develop lands that are wet, but you have to offset them. You have to mitigate them. We're going to be doing that with our landfill. We're going to be creating some wetland to make up for wetland we're losing by expanding the landfill. So that to me would be a reasonable compromise. If for architectural, engineering, or other reasons you want to put some turf in, then you mitigate it by offsetting it with something that'll drain better. So I don't want to be a stick in the mud, or stick in the astroturf, I guess, and totally oppose this. But I'd be very fine with number 2 if you want to.
And Alderman Patergula, for clarification on Alderman Janser and what City Manager Barry, essentially I think that is what was defined within that is drafting not just a blanket ordinance, but finding what City Manager Barry had identified. So in essence, yes, it was motioned as 1 and defined as 2.
Then I'm fine with that.
The council is clear on that. Alderman
Mr. Mayor,
Walski.
I would share that I am clear on that, and I think I would be, my intent all along in supporting this would have been under the understanding that when we get to the approval point, that there would have been some of this discretion and restriction in place. So I'm comfortable supporting.
We're all clear?
Mr. Mayor, I'd say that this opens up a lot of questions that we need to answer, and I think perhaps in the light of number 2, like a special use permit or some kind of permit that an applicant could apply for the grass, and each could be taken on a case-by-case basis. So if it was a drainage issue or something that had to be considered, then that could be through that permitting process that could be handled by staff, perhaps.
Thank you, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Final comments, Alderman Walski.
Mr. Mayor, I wonder if, we already have our own turf fields down in places in town, at Corbett Field and at South Hill Complex. But anyway, I think it's good that we're addressing this.
Yeah.
Further discussion? Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes, motion is approved. 8.5 is the contract for planning consulting services.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion to approve by Alderman Olson, second by, was that Alderman Pittner? Discussion. Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, I serve on this committee, and I don't think we're quite there yet. I think in conversations with a few members of our committee, the plan that's been presented at this point needs just, I think, a little more, how should I phrase this? Communicating, clearing, sort of conferring with the planning and steering committee, maybe the chairman. I spoke to Mr. Lang on the front of this meeting, and I think if we send this one back for 2 more weeks, I think it will be advantageous in terms of ensuring that this plan is not only the best one in terms of delivering what we need, but also delivering that decision with the full support of everybody who's associated with this work. So with that, I would move, I might ask a question of our city attorney, is there appropriate superseding motion that would send this back to provide some direction to Mr. Lang to confer with Mr. Ackerman, the chairman of this committee, for one more round before council consideration?
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, I think a motion to table until the next meeting with that direction would be appropriate.
So moved.
Motion to table by Alderman Wolski.
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion to table until our next council meeting. Alderman Pittner.
Just some brief comments that, thank you, Mayor. Just some brief comments on this, and I respect Alderman Wolski's insight sitting on the steering committee. I think if he feels it's advantageous, that it's worth tabling for 2 weeks. I was prepared to support this item, speaking with individuals in this industry, builders, developers, real estate agents. This is a necessary item that needs to be revamped and reworked, and I appreciate the effort, and I'm excited to get this work started with maybe a little further direction.
Thank you, Alderman Pittner. Perhaps I may need a little bit of clarification from staff with City Manager Barry or Lance on in terms of paring down. Are we talking about the scope of the project or the dollar amount or all of the above? Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, I would not suggest at this point that there is any conclusions about the proposal that's in front of us. I think it just needs a little more communicating from the bottom up and some input taking from those of us on the committee. So I think it's worthy of a delay is all.
Alderman Janser.
The reason I'm supporting sending this back is because of some conversations and some observations. We went through a revision of our zoning ordinance a while back, and we used a consultant for a large amount of the work, and we received a product that once we turned it loose in the wild had a whole bunch of flaws that were almost immediately in our faces. And quite frankly, I don't want to pay $135,000 to do that again. I want to see a product that I think we can have because it is developed by primarily, or at least the guts of it, are developed by our local people in the industry who have an understanding for what works in Minot, North Dakota. And so that's the reason that I'd like to see this clear before we go ahead and approve it.
Thank you, Alderman Janser. Some very good insight to the 2012 turning loose to the wild. I would also maybe just voice my opinion on it, knowing what that process was in 2012, watching the pendulums swing to one far end of the spectrum. And it would be, I think, our hope, the community's hope from what I've heard, not to see it swing all the way to the other side, but to find that middle ground that best works for our community. And I have no doubt the steering committee knows that, and Mr. Lang knows that, but to have that understanding, that to find what's best, obviously, for us and whatever comes out of that within that consulting group. So I will support it as well. Alderman Patrugula.
I've sat in on the meetings of this group along with Alderman Walsky, and I've been very impressed with what the group has done, but also it's become very obvious, especially with our shortage of staff, that this will be an overwhelming task. And I do need to, I think this is one of those not too frequent occasions where getting a consultant in makes sense to me. And I think outlining, clarifying, being absolutely sure about the scope of the work and what we're asking from the consultant is really critical, and particularly in view of the problems we had last time. And speaking as a consultant here for a minute, I was really disturbed by the fact that from what I've heard, the consultant came in and said, hey, this is what you have to do. That's not consultation. So I was very troubled by that. Consultants, at least as I see it, and most of my colleagues see it, isn't telling your client what to do. It's helping work something out. It's helping suggest alternatives. So there was something really, really, really wrong with the process that occurred back then. I wasn't on the council. I didn't know what was happening. I don't know what was happened or what happened. But I think it's worth taking another couple weeks and getting this down absolutely tight. We're talking about 135 grand. That's a lot of money. It really turned out to be I don't say boondoggle, but really an impediment in the progress of the city. So I think it's worth taking a couple of weeks and getting this absolutely right, or as close to it as we can.
Alderman Janser.
Just one more comment, and I guess it boils down to this. When this was presented in one form or initially, it sounded like staff support, as you just articulated, Alderman Patrugula, that the group needed additional staff support assistance in order to do this. When I read the proposal and when I hear consulting services, I get the impression that it takes us back to where the consultant is driving the process and so forth. And so that troubles me as it troubles you, Alderman Patrugula. So I would be very hesitant to go that direction.
And I think Mr. Lang and the rest of our steering committee and folks will be able to well define that moving forward with what does come from what comes back in 2 weeks.
As Mr. Mayor, I would say that the intent is to hire a consultant to help basically with manpower, because I'm the only one. I have a part-time assistant, and Margie Zietz is full-time doing code enforcement, so she can't do planning. So there's just not enough time to get it done. I think we're not looking for the consultant to tell us how it's going to be. We're going to tell them how it's going to be and have them do the work, the production work, to bring it in order to the committee, to the legal department. There's several different checkpoints that has to go through in the process before it finally gets to the council.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Yeah. Any further discussion on the motion?
Mr. Mayor, I will just briefly share that from my end, there is absolutely no question of my support for this ultimate, when we ultimately get there, or about the need for this help. But like everybody has said, we just one more round of getting it right. So.
Further discussion?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Seeing none, please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Patrugula?
Yes.
Motion to table was approved. That takes us to 8.6, the ombudsman position. On November 27th, 2018, the council met as the committee of the whole and discussed adding an ombudsman position to the city council. And at that time, the council determined that the position was worth exploring and requested that the city manager develop an approach for the ombudsman position by identifying the job description and determining the process for the administrative position. It's recommended the city council direct staff. We have 3 different items on here. Expand the customer service training program to include the implementation of a customer complaint response tracking process, and conduct a complete review of the existing request complaint tracker program and evaluate where improvements and efficiencies can be made, and evaluate the efficacy of a 311 program.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Pittner, second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion. Alderman Walsky.
City Manager, Mr. Berry, what is a 311 program? Help me out.
Well, Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, a 311 call is essentially a call that you can make from of course, any phone, and it would go directly to the city for information, complaints, concerns, observations, those sorts of things. It would be sort of like a dispatch center, if you will, for issues that customers or residents or business owners might have that they want the city's attention on.
Alderman Pontargula.
I think this is an excellent idea, and it grows, I think, quite nicely out of what we talked about at our planning retreat meeting. The only, and I note that I think Grand Forks has a 311. It's a common thing nationally. The one thing I guess I would add when this is looked at by staff is maybe looking at it maybe more positively and proactively. I think we do need a mechanism or several mechanisms perhaps to handle complaints and concerns by citizens. But I'd also, and I'd also like to broaden that in a sense to concerns and suggestions by staff. We talked at that meeting, for example, about some way of systematically recognizing staff for suggesting improvements that result in savings and efficiencies and more responsive city operations. So I would see this not just as a way of people lodging complaints and us working out grievances, but as a way of improving the city. One of the things that troubles me, to be very candid, is we sometimes have people come and say, you know, there's all this waste in the city and we could cut our taxes if we got rid of the waste. I'd like to know where that waste is. And I guess more importantly, so I think we need a mechanism for people, the average citizen, to submit to concerns or submit suggestions. And I think that ultimately is the most important thing about what we're going to be hopefully approving here, is working together as staff, as governance people, and as citizens to try to enhance the effectiveness and the efficiency of our government. So I would encourage, when the staff looks at this, to look at it as not just dealing with complaints or concerns or problems, but providing an opportunity to make suggestions to improve the thing. I would very much like to see the direction of our discussions change from addressing complaints or concerns to working more together as to how we can make things work better. So I think this is an excellent idea, but I would just encourage a slight broadening of the scope, both internally and in terms of the citizenry.
Thank you, Alderman Pontargula. Further discussion on the motion? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thanks. Once again, Mr. Berry, I appreciate the approach here. I appreciate the continued attention to these issues. What do you see as sort of maybe the next steps or the first identifiable steps or visible steps as a part of this? And is there a time frame for seeing it unfold at this point?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski. We've given some consideration to that. There are a couple of projects ahead of this one, including our community engagement strategy and a number of other things that we'd like to sort of polish off and get in front of you first. This is important. We recognize that. So I would say probably within 6 months we can have something available for you to essentially look at. That would include an evaluation of the existing complaint tracker database system, a possible expansion along with cost implications for that expansion of that system, some policies and procedures that we would like to develop to also include in our training for customer service training, and then some of the other areas that we've identified inside this document as well. So if you're okay with that time frame, that's what we'll shoot for. We'll put it on our list and start working to that end.
Thank you, City Manager Berry. Further discussion? Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Pittner?
Yes.
Pontargula?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to number 9 on our agenda for this evening, and we have Assistant Director of Public Works Jason Sorensen back at the podium for a presentation on recycling.
Here we go. Thank you, members of council. So it's been a while since we've discussed recycling. So just to recap, probably about, I don't know, must have been about 8 months ago or so, I brought the topic of recycling to the council. I think at that time there was basically a general consensus among the council at that time. I think some of you weren't necessarily up there, and there was a general consensus that yes, we should recycle. And at that time, my recommendation was basically the transfer, construct a transfer facility, collect recyclables, and ship them off to a sorting facility elsewhere. And the thought was, well, if we're gonna jump into this, is that the best option? Is there another option that can do the same thing, but maybe net us some revenue for the products and some of those things? So the path we embarked on, we went out for an RFQ and we consulted with the services of CPS. I have Melissa Knutson with me and Robert Craigs from Burns and McDonald that helped us put all this together. So we're going to talk through, a few different things. Look at the study objectives and the scope, the summary of the collection and processing, and then the summary of our findings. So this is just kind of a recap. We've had pretty considerable increase in waste acceptance over the last 20 years. A lot of that contributes to the growth that we've seen probably here in the last 10 or so. So I've got some statistics up there about the amount of MSW. Really, the reason this is coming forward to you guys as a council is one of the more common questions I get asked as the Assistant Director of Public Works is, why doesn't Minot recycle? So I'm bringing it up here and we're digging into it. So just to give you an idea of what I had tasked the consultants with, there's many different ways that this could all be looked at. So we looked at building a transfer facility. We'd collect basically the region from the trash from within our region, basically all of the customers that currently are tipping garbage at our landfill. That was what we considered our primary region, and looked at the volumes that could be expected there, and then designed facilities that could process that. And then as all these things rely on economies of scale, become more efficient. So we broadened that and looked at how much material would be available on a more broad basis, statewide, or at least from within distances that made sense for that material to come to us instead of to alternate facilities. So that's what Melissa and Bob have been working on. And from here, I will turn it over to them.
Thank you, Jason. Here to talk a little bit tonight about the methodology that was implemented in this study. There's a lot of things that go into estimating for a facility of this type, and most of those are rather subjective. And so it's very important in looking into investment for a facility such as this that everybody is on the same page about where things are coming from. And so when we looked into estimating how much collection potential there is in the area, both in the Minot area itself and in the outlying regions, we couldn't just look at how much is out there right now, because obviously without many recycling programs in the area, published data is not available. And again, being subjective, we had to look at multiple items of concern in this regard. So we looked at how would those recyclables be collected? Would it be curbside collections? Would it be drop-off? Different amounts are typically collected from those modes. We looked at how could those recyclables be collected? Would they be collected all together in what's called commingled collection, where all the different types of recyclables are in the same bin? Or would they be separated at the source? Like, in a lot of the older programs, you separate out your glass and your different types of plastics, things like that. And then there was also what I'll call the qualitative considerations rather than just the quantitative, in that how willing are people going to be to participate in these programs? How often would they be given the opportunity to do so? How often would they be given the opportunity for curbside pickup if such a program existed here? What communities would be involved along with the City of Minot in this endeavor? And also, what constitutes an urban community and a rural community, and how do those attitudes differ toward recycling? So when we looked at those, we used those considerations to develop what types of collection accounts would be estimated as part of this study, what types of rates in terms of how much each household in each different type of area would be anticipated to contribute to the program, And then also, how does that compare to established programs both in the area and far-reaching? And also, in the end, if you are looking at facility development of one type or another, how does that compare to what types of rates of material input that you would need to make those facilities operationally viable? And so when we started digging down into this, we did base most of this on residential collection activities, simply because a lot of the commercial entities in the area, if they do have what I'll call niche recyclables, a lot of times those industries are using those as a backhaul for some of their incoming freight, things like that. And so if you're going to rely on calculations or estimations of regularly available material, that's really what you have to go off of in this type of environment. It was estimated that approximately 50% of urban community households would contribute via curbside collection, and the reason for that is not that only half of any households would contribute, but places like 20plexes or larger residential facilities would not necessarily have a curbside bin for that collection. So when we talk about curbside collections for households, we're talking small density residential there. And on top of that, we did estimate that overall in this community, especially with the propensity that's been expressed for recycling here, that an overall 90% of the households would actually contribute in some form to the recycling stream. As we looked into the more outlying regions, we did recognize that in smaller communities it is more difficult and less cost-effective to implement curbside programs. And so in communities with less than 1,000 people, we estimated that they would have the opportunity to contribute to the recycling stream via more of a drop-off situation rather than a residential curbside pickup. Also, out in the very rural areas of North Dakota, there are other ways and other opportunities for MSW disposition. And with the limited opportunities there for hauling from those places and also with those other available opportunities, we estimated that participation would decrease to about 25%. So when we talk about urban communities in the area, they're listed on the slide in front of you here and include most of the major urban areas in the state. Those areas were not included in all of the regions, but only the secondary region. So based on these assumptions, the number of curbside accounts and drop-off accounts based on households are included on the slide. And how those would contribute to this recycling stream, the important thing about applying these numbers here is that as we started in this started locally, looked at how much recyclables would be coming in from the local area, anything applied on top of that as we expanded outward was applied in terms of incremental quantities. So for example, you see on the slide here that we estimated approximately 400 pounds per household per year for existing Minot MSW customers. But out in the secondary region in other urban communities, we estimated only about 300 pounds per household per year because of the increasing distance, the less propensity to participate in the program. But in performing that calculation, we did not decrease the local contribution to that 300 number. Those numbers were applied incrementally as we spread out. And so in doing that, as we compared these numbers to other programs in the area, we did compare our initial estimates to fully mature recycling programs in local communities of similar size. And they were seeing as well about 400 pounds per household per year when curbside was implemented as a collection mode. And they were also seeing about 100 to 200 pounds per household per year for drop-off. And so that's why we implemented the local 150 pounds number. And so applying that methodology to the number of accounts that we initially estimated, the quantities locally, we looked at the existing customers of the city MSW management facility and figured that approximately 3,600 tons of recyclables could be collected annually from that. Our initial comparative region went beyond that to include all of the former Department of Health Solid Waste Region 2 to try and spread that out a little bit. Fortunately or unfortunately, in performing that analysis, we found that due to the rural nature of that region, applying those assumptions resulted in only a very small incremental increase in that regard. And so because of that, we decided to say, okay, if the city decided to go all in, really maximize the education, what could we get? So we actually looked at statewide numbers and estimating all those urban areas coming in, and then figured if we were really, really successful in a program, we could maybe figure on capturing half of that if things went really well. And so based on that, the secondary region, or the what I'll call the economy of scale region, was anticipated to max out at just under 9,000 tons a year. So important things to remember here in terms of considering these quantities. Those quantities are inclusive of both residential curbside and other drop-off collections. And they were, after initial independent generation, compared to a few other external numbers for reasonability, those being national average MSW diversions and how those would relate to participation in the program, published industry data, and the most important one, because you can find a lot of data out there that doesn't apply, either because of a different community setting, a different nature of where the community is or how the disposition of the community is. But the most important comparison that was made was comparison to other North Dakota programs and the quantities that they're seeing coming in. And these numbers based on number of households and development of the program were actually quite comparable to those programs. And also of note in this regard is these numbers are a lot less than the typical industry standard for development of a fully automated recyclables processing facility. Those facilities that actually process and send recyclables out to the end market typically start operation at about 10 tons an hour for the facility, which equates to about 20,000 tons a year. So again, as Jason mentioned, when we start looking at economies of scale, that was why we chose initially to really expand the search area in terms of quantity estimation.
Melissa, can I interrupt you there?
Absolutely.
In terms of the 10 tons per hour, is that assumption built on a one-shift operation or a three-shift operation in terms of, you know, a 9 to 5 or a 24-hour-a-day operation? Just curious if that's built into this.
This is Bob Craigs with Burns & McDonnell, and he can speak a little better than I can. Okay. It's my understanding that that would apply to the actual facility mechanical operation, but I'll let Bob speak to that.
Yeah, that's correct. Mr. Mayor, Council, the 10 tons per hour is the measure of how it's designed. So
can we have you talking to the mic so everybody at home?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. The 10 tons per hour refers directly to the processing system and what it's designed to handle. So Alderman Wolski, you could run 1 or 2 shifts. So that's just the way that it's designed.
And since he's here, we did take those numbers and we brought in consultant Burns & McDonnell to examine different options for processing and end use of those materials, and I will defer to Bob for that discussion.
Good evening again, Mr. Mayor, Council. So as Melissa said, I'm going to talk about the processing of the materials. As Melissa mentioned, we utilized a series of assumptions based on existing programs to come up with quantity estimates, and the quantities of recyclables that are collected are critical to determining what size of the facility as well as the options that you would want to utilize. And then as you saw in the summary that Jason provided, we use that information specifically then to estimate cost and to talk about what we see as the best fit. So we looked specifically at 3 options, as it says there on your screen. We have 2 different size material recovery facilities, and a material recovery facility is basically a facility that does the processing of the materials and then ultimately ships those to end markets. And as Melissa outlined, we looked at 2 different sizes. The rationale for that, again, was to address two different regions, as well as you can see what I would call the economies of scale, again, as Jason outlined. Secondly, and in light of some of the conversation that you had previously about consultants and the need to collaborate and listen, we certainly understood the importance of looking at a consolidation facility. And so these options were developed in collaborating with Jason around what some of your previous options were that you looked at. So a consolidation facility is different than a materials recovery facility. Essentially, you collect the materials in some sort of commingled fashion. The recyclable materials, you drop them on the floor, then you consolidate them and put them in a transfer trailer and long haul them. So you're not doing any processing. So that's the key difference. And then lastly, some other communities in North Dakota, as well as the upper Midwest, they contract directly with a vendor for the collection, the processing, and the marketing of those materials. So that's why we included that also as an option. So this particular slide, to give you some pictures as opposed to not all numbers, this gives you a sense of what a materials recycling facility would actually look like. Essentially it would take the materials and process them, bale them up and prepare them essentially for reuse. A single stream recycling facility is one that's a combination of labor and automated. So essentially what you have is you have this conveyor where there are some staff that are pulling materials, but there's also different types of equipment that process the materials. We looked at two different size buildings that would house the equipment, because the smaller facility would use different types of equipment than a full single stream recycling processing equipment would. Again, as Melissa outlined, we have 4,000 tons per year and 8,750 tons a year. This particular photo is in McLeod County, Minnesota. It's basically a county of about 30,000. The county owns and operates the facility and uses a mix of staff to do that. It gives you kind of a sense of some of the activities. As I mentioned previously, the materials are dropped on the floor, the equipment's pushed into a conveyor to the processing system, and then ultimately through a combination of automated equipment as well as staff, the materials are sorted. Interestingly enough, in this day and age of technology, I had the opportunity last week actually to go and see a facility that's using robots. This particular facility in Minnesota actually works with the Shelter Workshop to provide jobs, so it offers some substantial social benefits too. Under this particular option then, once the materials are processed, they are baled and they're put in transfer trailers, and what we assumed in our analysis for Minot is very similar to other MRFs of this size, where you would contract with a broker that would help essentially market those materials. And there's a number of communities of Minot size that work with brokers to get best pricing for end use, and that's something that we considered, both in terms of the transportation as well as in terms of the sales of the recovered materials. As I mentioned, the other option that we talked about and that Jason referred to is the consolidation and transfer facility. Again, this one is 4,000 tons per year. This kind of gives you a sense of what it would look like. It looks like a transfer station, so it's a smaller building than a materials recovery facility. What we assumed is a pre-engineered metal building. It would actually have a compactor unit, so you compact the materials once they're dropped on the floor. It's put in a walking floor trailer, and then it would be hauled to a facility that processes it. So again, the distinction is here is that you're consolidating the materials. It's long hauled to a processor. The processor then would process those materials. You pay a fee for those materials to be processed, and then the processor would provide the city with some revenues from the sale of those materials. As I mentioned, the third option is the contract option. Again, the perspective here is similar to what's taking place in Grand Forks and Bismarck, where essentially the city's contract with the vendor to collect those materials. We assume that those materials would be collected from the existing customers that the city presently serves on the residential side. There would be no processing facility that would be developed. You would competitively procure a vendor to come in and do this, just like you would do with some of your other services, and there would be no return on revenue. So those are options that are being used around the, in North Dakota and in the upper Midwest. And there's a number of assumptions as was outlined by Melissa as it relates to collection and processing. So obviously when you're doing cost estimates, you need to make sure you're looking at more than just the initial capital outlay. What are the operations and maintenance costs? This slide just gives you a sense of some of those considerations. We looked at it over a 15-year time, whereby we're able to basically look at the associated debt service with some of the capital purchases. As you heard me mention, we assume certain building sizes. We have mechanical processing equipment. We have some rolling stock. You talked about a wheel loader this evening. This would be like a skid steer loader. We assumed essentially that it would be on or near the existing solid waste facility. Therefore, you would be able to share staff and that there would be no cost in terms of land purchase. You'll also see that in the instance of the haul from here, we have some contract hauling cost. You also need to have O&M cost, equipment maintenance, as well as the labor and utilities. I mentioned the brokerage fees in terms of marketing the materials, the processing fees for the processing company, and then the revenue from the sale of recovered materials. So all of that went into essentially developing this particular estimate and how we wanted to compare these options. So those particular assumptions that were used both in terms of the quantities, those drive the size of the facility, which has to do then with the capital cost for the building. The quantity of materials also drives the types of equipment that you would use. I talked about the O&M costs, which are the labor, equipment maintenance. We also have other annual fees and costs, and those include brokerage fees for basically the MRF options. For the consolidation facility, we're assuming that there would be a third party that would be contracted with to haul the materials from here in Minot to a processor in the Twin Cities. And then annual revenues. One of the biggest conversations I have with city councils when I work with them on recycling is there's myths in terms of the scope of the revenues that are generated. Revenues that are generated can be substantial, as you can see here, as much as $437,500 in the larger MRF. At the same time, they do not offset the total cost of processing the materials. So the net annual revenue line provides the annual cost based on each of these options. And you can see, just as a reminder, we've got the quantity of materials that would be processed for each of those options. So if you come down to the estimated revenue or cost per ton of recyclables, the smaller MRF of 4,000 tons per year, where the materials are processed here, you work with a broker who then ultimately markets those materials and you receive some revenues. That's $254 per ton. The larger MRF, that's 8,750 tons, is $175 per ton. The consolidation facility, you would see much less capital outlay, as you can see in the annual capital cost, as well as less O&M cost. But the long haul costs to a processor are substantial. Therefore, the estimated per ton cost is $211. And then again, for comparisons, if you would contract out the collection and the processing and the end use for your residential customers, it would be $450 per ton. So in keeping all of this in mind, this is the one aspect of determining what's best. Obviously for Minot, looking at these, we had a set of assumptions so we can compare, as they say, apples to apples. There's a number of cost variations on this or considerations, and I just wanted to emphasize certainly the capital outlay, the staffing that you would want to use, and then ultimately how this aligns with your program that you're planning to implement. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
So just to recap, basically, what we run into, those numbers look pretty expensive, and it really comes down to the quantity. We're we're kind of up here in the middle of nowhere, and quantities are limited. So achieving that economy of scale to make these things, you know, more close to a break even are very difficult. So, you know, when we get into a program, it's going to be very critical to maximize participation and then limit contamination, which leads into a very extensive education program. We've met with a few different sorting facilities that offer some of those services, and there's some very aggressive training programs that can be implemented. Some different things we can look at, like collection. We can look at, initially when we proposed this, we'd continue to have twice-a-week collection and then just swap one of those days for recycling. Another one could be that we do twice-a-week collection 1 week, and then the next week we just swap one of those days for recycling, so you'd have every other week recycling. You know, anecdotally, some of the people that I've talked to in Bismarck, one of their common complaints is that people have every other week recycling collection, but people complain that that's not frequent enough. So, you know, just things to work through. Then some other things to look at as we get into implementing, maybe consider some drop-off locations of some of our, to provide an avenue for some of our rural subdivisions. They're just not large enough customers, I guess, or concentrated enough for a private hauler to really offer a curbside service, so this would give them an opportunity. Can look at trying to create some collection points for multifamily residential or maybe even some commercial entities. So I guess going forward, you know, the big takeaway and the thing we need to remember is no matter what we want to do, there's going to be a net cost scenario. So recycling, you know, in the current state of the recycling industry, there isn't a profit margin in this type of thing. Existing recovered material markets are right now at historic lows. They're not reflective of historic average. So the numbers that we presented today are based on today's state of the recycling industry. We would hope going forward 15 years that things would improve. There are things that are improving in the industry across the nation. They're becoming more domestic opportunities for processing of plastics and some of these things. And then these estimates that we provided are based on fully developed programs. And, you know, so rollout day one, we're not going to have 4,000 tons of material to process here in Minot. It's probably going to take upwards of 3 to 5 years to develop some of those quantities. So in the end, I guess when we look at the options we analyzed, we still recommend to, you know, do the consolidation and transfer and then haul to Minneapolis. So that facility, if we were to build that and we decided that these are all kind of modular and things could be added onto them, we could do transfer for a couple years, get a recycling program going, see what the volumes look like. If we wanted to do a small sorting facility, those components could be added on later, certainly. So, yeah, this is basically, you know, kind of what I just talked about. You know, there's some community outreach that we're going to have to go into. We have to work with some of these small communities and see what kind of avenues we can provide to entice them to want to recycle. So there's some things to look into for the program development. There's another set of containers that would have to be purchased. Again, agree on a schedule. And then, of course, the education component, which is very important to any of these that get started. So with that, I would, I guess, yield to any questions. I presented this as a informational item. I am not looking for you guys to say, let's start recycling. I just wanted to keep the ball rolling and keep the discussions going, and I'm certainly open to chasing some more ideas or things if you want.
Thank you, Jason, and Melissa and Bob. Appreciated some really great information. I had a question right from, I guess, maybe on Bob's part in terms of the transfer and the long haul. Really outside of the box, we happen to sit on 2 Class I railroads, And discussions that I had with a BNSF person said, short haul, which would be from here to Minneapolis, rail-wise, isn't economical, but long haul on rail actually gets a lot more economically feasible to like Seattle. Is anybody else doing any kind of rail transfer in recycling? I know that's a stretch, but sometimes we got to think outside of the
No,
model.
Mr. Mayor, it's a good question. It's back to economies of scale. The short answer is yes. Some of the MRFs, material recovery facilities in the Twin Cities, for example, the larger ones that are owned by some of the international waste management companies, actually are located to rail spurs. And once they process the materials, they put them on rail and they would haul them. For example, there's a number of domestic waste paper markets in Canada. So they're hauled there, and there is others that are going to the coast also. So that's usually with larger facilities and typically with end markets, as opposed to your question directly, to consolidating existing materials that are collected and then taken actually directly to a processor.
Okay, thank you. Further questions for Jason or any of the other? Alderman Wolski.
I think I've got probably a number of questions. I don't think I need to probably ask them all, but Mr. Craig, right, last name?
Craigs.
Yeah, Craigs?
Yeah, well,
okay.
Bob's fine.
Okay, so Bob, this is my question, right? In terms of looking at the evaluation and the numbers, and even in, Minot's modest case, our best economy of scale that we forecast seeing is costing us $175 per ton to process and deal with recyclable material. What economy of scale gets that number back to zero? And then beyond that, what gets this return to the actual positive? I'm trying to figure out why anybody in the country, including private MRFs, are recycling, if it's just costing.
It's a good question. Again, the economies of scale drive it. It's also the revenues. So to give you an example, communities, let's just say Community X, size 100,000 people, they develop their own MRF and they work on a regional basis to bring in other materials. Back to the question you had before about a 10 ton per hour facility, 20,000 tons per year of materials begins to get you close to that. But that also would need to be coupled not only with revenues from the sale of materials, but in most communities there's a charge or a bundled portion of the fee that are charged residents for that recycling. So for example, $3 per household. One of the communities I work with is Sheridan, Wyoming. So it's a relatively rural community. They charge $3 per household, and they also get revenues from the sale of the recyclables. And so if they had the economies of scale, back to your question of 20,000 tons per year, it would be close to a net wash.
But not a net wash, though, because it's costing every household an additional $3.
Yeah, yes, if you put it that way, yes. I was just suggesting that the revenues,
Sure.
but to suggest that the revenues from the sale of the recyclables are going to cover all the cost of processing, I'm not suggesting that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So hopefully it helps.
Yep.
Further questions this evening, Alderman Pittner?
Just a quick question for maybe Jason. What options do residents of Minot have for recycling, whether it be the private sector or whatnot, in the city of Minot at this point?
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Pittner, they're pretty limited. I would say probably Calyx is going to be the main one. They're fairly limited on what they accept. I know some of the big box stores have some drop-offs for like glass and plastic bags, and things of that nature. But.
Further questions, Alderman Wolski?
Probably for Bob as well. Just kind of some general information on the industry I'm looking for right now. What are the most valuable commodities? I mean, my assumption would be that if we were to develop a single sort stream here in Minot, we'd be looking at certain plastics. We'd be looking at, obviously metal and aluminum and cardboard, glass perhaps. On the scale of, most valuable to least valuable, where are we at? And are we seeing communities become a little more particular with what they're accepting in order to maximize revenue or generate the most return from what they're collecting?
So to your first question, aluminum cans, corrugated is old corrugated containers, or as they like to say in the industry, those little brown boxes from Amazon. those are pretty. The corrugated is pretty stable in terms of a per ton price. The plastics, number ones and number twos, for many years have been pretty valuable. The number 3 through number 7, that's the resin numbers. Those are the ones that they're having a real hard time marketing. Alderman Walski, as you probably read, they have pretty much no value, and mixed paper has very little value at this point in time. So related to those markets and your second question, there are communities that are looking at, if they're starting a program, what would be the materials they would want to collect. Maybe they would not want to collect certain items. And Jason and I, Melissa, were talking beforehand, and we talked about glass, for example. A number of single stream programs don't begin with collecting glass for a number of different reasons. It's heavy, it doesn't have a lot of value. So that would be one item that you might collect or have in a drop-off program. The overall industry, as Jason outlined, the markets right now are at historical lows. There's a rebalancing that's taking place. You probably maybe have heard of what they call the China sword, which beyond the tariff issue, China has said they don't want any more of the United States waste paper and recyclable materials. So they've changed the restrictions. And so what that's resulted in is there's a number of entities domestically that are adding end-use capacity. So in other words, recycle the materials here that were being shipped to China. So I expect that there'll be some rebalancing. In the short term, the markets will remain probably not very good, but in the long term, we expect them to go back to historical levels. That was probably more than what you asked me.
Further questions, Alderman Padragula.
I had 3 questions at this point. I guess the first question is, this is your historical markets and prices. If we were, it's kind of like the stock market, if we were to go back to those levels, would that take us significantly below the $175 per ton that would cost us?
So that's also a good question, Mr. Mayor, Alderman. And I've heard your name pronounced many times, but I'll stay with Steve if that's okay.
Please.
What we've assumed is what's called a per ton number for revenue. So we're assuming revenues would be $50 a ton for recyclable materials. So to put that in perspective, to answer your question more directly, a couple years ago it was over $100 a ton. So that's how much the average dollar amount per ton of recyclable material for the sale of that has dropped. So it would certainly impact, and we can do some sensitivity analyses if that's something that you and the council and Jason would like us to do, and you can see what impact it would have, but it certainly wouldn't take it down to zero.
But it would take it down.
It basically could double the amount of revenues. So if we go back to the slide, if I can go the right way, Bob. Well, so you can see that the annual revenues were $200,000 and $437,500 if you built your own MRF here. So let's just say hypothetically 3 years from now it goes up to $100 a ton. So we're doubling the amount of revenues. You can see that it has an impact, but it still results in a net cost.
Second question, I think that's very helpful, and perhaps some sanity will come to this world, and there actually be a more value put on recyclables. But anyway, the second question I had was just I want to make sure I understand. I think this is more for Jason. The recommendation. The recommendation, if we decide to go at some point with recycling, would be to collect it and then sort it in different types, and then once those types are sorted, like plastics, corrugated, or whatever, then they would be bundled and shipped as a discrete unit to some other facility where they would be ultimately end staged. Is that what you're proposing, or what makes
Mayor
sense?
Sitma, Alderman Padragula, my recommendation is, at this point, not to get into the sorting world.
So this would just be collection then?
We'd collect it, compact it, and then send it to Minneapolis.
For everything else?
Yep.
Okay. And the third question, I guess I've asked this before, Jason, and I'm not much on economics, and you've given me an answer, and it still hasn't sunk in. And the reason also I'm asking the question is I just went recycling to Calyx this weekend, and I came back with like $2 or $3. How come when I take my, I know, Calyx doesn't come to my home and pick it up, but how come I get money when I deliver it to Calyx? I mean, certainly they have to sort it, they have to ship it somewhere. They don't charge me except for electronics to go to Calyx. What am I missing here? Why do I get money when I personally take it to a recycling facility? And here we're talking about a major expenditure for the entire city.
That's probably a great question. Calyx is very particular about what they're processing, and they're not sorting materials, so they don't have the operation costs of sorting. Basically, when people bring the materials in, so what we're looking at in our program is single sort or commingled curbside program.
Right.
So you, as a resident of Minot, have a bin, you put paper, plastic, metals, glass, put it all in there, and then we ship it to somebody else and have it taken apart. Calyx accepts these materials sorted already. They have a bin, you put cardboard in the cardboard bin, you put plastic in the plastic bin. So their people aren't spending nearly as much time as pulling these materials back apart.
Okay. From this past weekend, the only sorting I did basically was aluminum cans versus everything else. That's the only sort I made, and everything else got dumped into a shopping cart or a hamper.
Okay. Take a swing at it.
Just to follow up, it's the aluminum cans because of their value.
Right.
So the value of the aluminum cans, as well as I think it's just probably the cultural process of bringing back your aluminum cans. I mean, historically in most communities, it's just worked that way as like a deposit type program where you're getting money for that. So it's the aluminum cans by separating those out and the value that they have. They're about $1,000 a ton is what you would get if you basically took aluminum cans and put them in a baler and shipped them off.
But again, I still don't understand. I apologize again for my lack of knowledge in economics. Why do they pay me money, whereas here we're talking about paying somebody a lot of money?
Well, I think Jason's answer is the best that I can do too. Is it a nonprofit organization? Yeah, that's part of it. And then also I would say that they don't have the labor cost. It'd be interesting, Alderman Steve, to ask them where their end market is for their aluminum and how the aluminum cans then are getting there. That would be the follow-up question to see what kind of arrangement they have.
I had one more question, I guess, during our discussion. You said something about deposits. Is there some way to affect the economics of this if we charged either the city or the state or the county charge some sort of deposit fees on bottles, for example, or cans or plastic bags or something? Would that improve the finances here?
I don't know that there's much that's going to improve the finances as how things sit. My reading of some of these bottle laws and some of these deposit programs is it's you're basically taking the high revenue products out of your mixed stream, which then makes your mixed stream more worthless than it was before. So
thank you for your candor.
It's all these juggling acts with these materials.
Okay, thank you. It's helped me. Thank you.
I guess just to put some of this in perspective. So, when you look at like I said, my recommendation would be to collect, transfer. So at $211 a ton, so there's basically what our capital outlay for that would be a building and a compactor and then 2 compactor trailers. And then, so we would own that stuff and then we would contract hauling. the hauling cost is estimated to be about $110 a ton. So basically, other than the capital outlay for the building and the compactor, that facility could be run with existing staff at the landfill, based on, at least for the first couple years, based on the quantities of what we would see and what we'd expect for the first couple years.
Alderman Janser.
Okay, so do the rest of the math. I mean, what does that translate? I didn't pull the number of residential source pickup locations that were in the previous slides, but if you do the math, what does that come out to per household, per month, or per year?
So that hauling cost that I was talking about, that's about, I think it's about $4. I would have to consult the calculator.
So it's dangerous to do math in public, I realize.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't really broke it down at this point to the cost per resident.
Okay.
Because on that, when you expand that further and you look at, we're looking at this 4,000 ton number. Some of those are our customers that are going to be, that would pay an additional fee on their residential sanitation bill. Some of these people wouldn't necessarily see that fee, but their private hauler would be paying a different tipping fee for that material as it comes here. So,
well, Mr. Mayor, if I, so, and I guess that was the other question that I had is, I mean, if you, the 4,000 tons per year presumes that there is a regional program of some kind. So it seems to me like if that's kind of where the economy of scale exists, and it looks like that's the case, given the recommendation for a transfer and haul type operation, it seems like before we do anything further, we ought to start figuring out if we can set up such a regional kind of operation. Because absent that, we're going it alone on 2,600 tons a year, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Jason, just one quick question, and is that also taking into consideration, as I think it was Melissa that had said, like the 20-plex on the big commercial stuff, that's taking into that account that number as well with utilizing recycling?
Mayor Sitma, that's addressed in a couple of different ways depending on where those things are located. This is typically based on, again, simply residential, but it does involve those big 20-plexes being able to have access to drop-off facilities and being able to contribute in that fashion. It does not assume that they have access to curbside facilities. Curbside was limited to anything 4-plex and under in that estimation. And if I may, I'd also like to add one thing to the previous discussion of costs and how that relates to the materials that are coming in. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
One thing to remember is some of those, what I'll call less desirable materials that affect the current state of the market, i.e. what Bob discussed previously about the cost coming down from $100 a ton to only about $50 a ton. Some of those less desirable materials are among the heavier materials. And so when we talk about removing those from the waste stream, the other calculation that we have to be sure to include is the fact that that subtracts a lot of weight. And so when we actually look then at the per ton costs for those lighter materials, that would be limited. And so again, back to the current question, if we're looking at from local customers only, about 2,600 ton of commingled recyclables, that's where we run into the issue of the economy of scale.
Alderman Wolski, you had a question.
Kind of a comment here, speaking a bit to Alderman Janser's line of thought, which is, I do think, as we all contemplate this, there is one assumption that is built into this methodology and model that I think we need to keep in mind, which is that it seems to all be built on a single sort stream picked up at the curbside. My assumption would be, and you guys feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if the city of Minot wanted to undertake recycling, but we did not have the stomach for $211 a ton, we would be able to perhaps create a facility that allows drop-off at the landfill, places a burden of sorting on residents, and essentially then we have a building and a baler. Might be a dramatic simplification of the operation, but that would also be a dramatic reduction in the costs that allows us to still provide recycling in this community. Maybe not on the scale that we have previously imagined or wanted, but I just offer it out there. I'm not proposing that course. Please speak to any of those assumptions if they're incorrect. I would gladly.
If I may, Mayor Sitma, Alderman Walsky, you are correct in the initial assumption that that does take away some of the collection costs, but herein, these are processing costs only. So as Jason alluded to earlier, the collection costs would be taken care of by simply switching your current biweekly collections, one to recycling. And so that pickup cost actually isn't even here. And so when we're talking about the distribution of the materials via curbside or via drop-off, the function of implementing drop-off collections only in this regard would most likely serve to reduce the quantities coming in and also the quality of those, because the drop-off collections are what I'll call a little more of the Wild West. You know, you end up with more contamination that way. And so it would be my opinion in that regard that that would serve to increase the per ton costs.
Jason, maybe correct me if I'm wrong too. Fargo at one time did do the sorting curbside and moved to bulk simply because participation was not very well in the sorted.
Mayor Sitma, you're correct. They had a sorted program. Basically, they gave you, I think, a blue, a green, and a yellow bin, or maybe it was just a blue. I think it was just a blue bin, and you were supposed to break. It was really complicated, I guess, for a recycling program, because on recycling day, you took your cardboard boxes and broke them down and laid them on the ground. You put your blue tote on top of that, and in the tote, you had separate bags of plastic, metal, and glass, and then in the bottom of the bin is where you put your loose paper. And yeah, their participation rates were very low. And right now, they just went to curbside single sort like I'm presenting today, and I think their participation rate, I want to say that their participation rates are in excess of 85%. Okay. So.
Further questions for Jason, Alderman Walsky?
Not so much a question for Jason, but kind of a comment on this larger perspective, or this larger issue, I guess, which we seem to be living in this weird world again where recycling costs us on a per ton basis an extraordinary amount. There is no part of me that would want more participation in this. And I know that's really odd and challenging to say, but if we were to, the best case scenario would be to implement single sort recycling and then hope nobody does it. And I agree that's a really, I apologize for the strangeness of that comment, but we need a recycling system whereby the incentive and the economics of this thing are good for us, where we have more participation. And right now, it's not there. It doesn't even look like it's close to there. And so, I want this community to be able to project that we have sort of a forward thinking and an environmental stewardship. But right now, I'm struggling with the economics of this in terms of the viability.
City Manager Barry, you had a comment?
Question? Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Going back to my public works days, and a lot of what's been said here is absolutely confirmed by my experience in 18 years of public works. Last town I was in, we went from single sort to commingle recycling, the evolution that you're talking about here. We went to every other week in recycling. We've done a number of things. One of the things to change the equation, if you fundamentally want to shift it, it doesn't necessarily take care of the cost side of the equation, but that is participation. Obviously, we've heard that the more participation we have, it drives the cost down. One of the things we have to explore yet is a franchise agreement or series of franchise agreements with some of our collectors. Those franchise agreements can also prescribe recycling program requirements in them. As well, we own our own landfill, and so if the city wanted to, it could prescribe certain types of requirements for disposal of materials at the landfill that would also incentivize a recycling approach to be taken. Those things haven't been considered in any of these analyses, but there are other ways to sort of come at this, which may be incentivizing on one level the recycling initiative, but it won't change the cost component. So I think one of the things we generally like to know is this something that's still intriguing enough for us to maybe refine some of the thoughts or approaches here with maybe additional assumptions? Or is this something that we're just going to maybe concede isn't ripe for our community based on an economic decision?
Alderman Janser.
I will attempt to respond to the city manager in this way. I think that there is certainly a desire on the part of a number of people in the community to do recycling. And kind of going back to what Alderman Wolski said, I don't think we do it because it makes us money. I mean, I don't think that's, you know, your comment makes sense from an economic point of view, certainly, and we all can see that. But the reason people are interested in doing recycling is because it's good for the planet. It isn't because it makes money. And so we have to find a way to balance that. And so in answer to City Manager Barry, I think it's desirable and intriguing enough, if that's the word, to do some further research, do some further work to try to figure out, you know, if there's a way. But if not, you know, if we, you know, then we have to come to grips with, you know, are we willing to pay for it? Because it is desirable enough in terms of the greater good and what it means for the planet and for our region environmentally. And so I'd like more information, frankly.
I think you had made a very good point, Alderman Janser, and one of the big pieces of information that we do need is that regional component of what their participation rate would be or should be within our regional landfill design. So I think that is some information that we could definitely look forward to down the road. Alderman Padragula, we should probably think about not keeping our librarian too much longer.
A question and a comment following up on what Mark said. I guess the question I have is, how do other communities make this work? You know, at the one extreme politically, places like Berkeley and Portland. At the other extreme, probably many Midwestern communities. Are they also in the same bind, or do they benefit from having huge quantities? I mean, how come we're kind of the outlier? How come all these other places do it and we?
I think you used the best word, outlier.
Is that it?
That's where we're at.
Is it the geography?
We're 500 miles from the nearest sorting facility.
So if this were Portland and we had our own recycling facility, it would be viable economically?
Well, I don't know if it'd be viable economically, but you're certainly not going to be burning costs up and just trucking stuff across the state or states.
So I wanted to ask the consultancy outsiders too about that.
So the economies of scale does make a difference, as you mentioned. Also, I would agree with Jason. It's the geography, both in terms of hauling to a processing facility as well as to an end user. So communities in North Dakota and others that are doing this, if they're providing the service, then it's going long distances for recovery and end use.
Okay. Thank you. The comment to follow up on what Mark was saying is, yeah, and this is one of the most perplexing situations I've been in. I agree with Josh that it doesn't make any economic sense. I mean, it's bizarre. And yet I keep thinking, you know, of our values or my values and probably Mark's values and those of a lot of other people in the community. It really seems like the right thing to do for many, many reasons, many perspectives. And, you know, I'm not thinking the goal should be to make money on this. I guess I just don't want to lose quite as much as we're talking about here. So I would like to see it looked at further. Maybe using the constraints we can impose on people using our landfill or whatever, but it seems to be a very odd position to be in. We're doing the right thing. Pretty much everybody agrees this is the right thing, just as so uneconomical. There's something screwy here, and I haven't quite come on it. Maybe it's our national or international policies about this, but it just really, I'm really stuck here on this one. So I'd like to see it studied further.
Further comments, questions, discussion?
Are you going? Mayor Sitma, I appreciate it. There's just a couple things. One, and I think this is kind of relevant to the scale and the region we've evaluated, but and I don't know how to determine it, or if you guys have methods, that would be great. But it seems to me that we have a market not that far too north of us in terms of Estevan and Brandon and Regina. I don't know where these communities are sending their materials, but we certainly have, I think, on whole, a culture that is more receptive, more used to recycling, and I don't know if there's a way to add that market to our estimates to get us to an economy of scale. Jason, feel free to comment. You stood up right away. I don't know if we can even get recyclables across the border.
I believe that there's a sorting facility in Regina.
Sure.
So they're acting as the regional hub up in that.
Sure.
So when you look at this across the country, that we keep talking about economies of scale. So what's kind of been adopted, across the nation is these central spoke or central hub with long spokes is what I've heard it referred to as in different publications. So this isn't completely uncommon for us to be trucking stuff 500 miles. I believe in a conversation with Demcon, one of the processors out in the Minneapolis area, he's getting material from, I think, about 900 miles is his furthest customer. Obviously those people aren't expecting to make money on it. They feel that they have an obligation to the environment, and they're willing to pay, what that fee is for that to happen.
One closing comment here. Jason, I appreciate your perspective on all of this. As I look at this question and I sort of evaluate the challenge, which is we want to do the right thing, we want to act as good stewards, and is this program and the loss of an estimated $842,000 a year, is there a better way to have a better impact on the environment if we were to apply those dollars differently? And so I, like I said at the start here, I want us to get to the right place, and I want us to be better stewards. I want Minot to be viewed as an environmentally sensitive and conscious place, because I think that's important. But yeah, much more looking at this on lots of different levels to evaluate if the dollars we choose to spend are going to be spent most effectively.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jason.
So
any closing comments?
I guess before I sit down, I've been told that we need a lot more analysis, and I don't know exactly what I'm to analyze. I
think a piece on that, Jason, is definitely the outlier. Can we count on that rural component? So the analysis might be reaching out to the folks within the demographic or the regional aspect that I think that we had identified within this, within even our haulers, on whether or not they're viable or willing candidates that are going to add to that tonnage. I think that that's one important piece of it that I took away from there. And I see City Manager Barry here with some other thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Maybe just a quick thought for the council. There are a number of ways that maybe we could approach this that I think Jason may be concerned about, because we could spend a lot of consulting money going a number of different directions. I think probably the first thing we would like to know is there an appetite by the City Council to have residents pay for recycling? And to what extent, cost-wise, would that look like? And maybe tonight's not the answer for that. Maybe it needs some time for you to think about that. But we know recycling will cost us money. There's no question around. There's no scenario we've seen tonight where it doesn't cost us money. The question is, how much are we willing to bear? And I think if we had that information, we could then go take a find-a-way approach and see, based on that dollar amount, can we get it done? And we can look at a number of different kind of things, maybe long hauling, maybe consolidation of facilities, other sorts of things, based on that dollar range. And if we knew what that dollar range was, that may be the showstopper. If we said $2 is it per household per month, or $4 is it per household per month, we may have our answer sooner than we think without much additional analysis. So I guess I would say maybe that's a way to suggest moving down the road, is give us some parameter there. Again, maybe not tonight, but when you're comfortable, and then we can use that and plug it into some of the models that have been created and evaluate whether or not that's possible.
Jason, would that be able to be broke down to what our cost is given these parameters on per household, and then we can start tracking on appetite?
Yeah, we can certainly look at that.
All right.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Alderman Olson, sorry.
I would love to hear from people on this. I hope that we get a lot of responses from this, either through social media or through letters to the editor or emails to us. I really am curious to know what people think.
And given that, I think it's more than yes or no, but what is the appetite too? Because that really is the defining question. We know it's going to cost how much per household, what their appetite is.
You know, this is one of those kinds of issues that some people feel extremely strongly about. It's kind of an emotional issue for them. And, you know, other people, frankly, would just as soon see us keep burying it in the landfill. So, you know, I know we've done some voting online stuff in the past. I mean, I think, you know, I think it's very important that we get, once we have some of those numbers and can kind of say, okay, this is kind of what it looks like, citizens, I think it's very important that we have some kind of broad input and figure out what the community really wants, what the majority of the community really wants, because there are going to be people on both ends of the spectrum and a whole bunch of folks somewhere in the middle. So
depending on how long it takes, there is that opportunity 1 year from June.
Mr. Mayor, I have one closing comment here, and then I promise I will not say another word. But we have a tangentially related topic to this, which is a few months ago, some concerned citizens brought us a proposal related to plastic bags. The Environmental Policy Group, I believe at that time, we suggested that we were going to perhaps take up that question at the time we considered our larger recycling question. I think the expectation from that community was that they were hopeful to see maybe that on our agenda as attached to this presentation. I think obviously this item it sort of preempts that question in a lot of ways, as well as some legislation down in Bismarck that I think is relevant to that conversation as well. But I just wanted to at least acknowledge the fact, perhaps at an upcoming meeting, we can provide an update to where we think that's going to be most appropriately considered, just so we can continue to communicate about that topic too.
Further discussion on the issue. City Manager Barry.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Wolski, I would say that we're going to watch that legislation closely. That's going to have more of an impact than anything else at this point. So the staff doesn't have any plans to take up that subject until we find out what the legislature wants to do. If they don't allow it statewide because of the legislation they're proposing, we're sort of sunk at that point anyway. So if the council's okay, that's what we're planning to do, is hold off until we find out what the legislature wants to do.
Which is not that far away. Thank you. With that, I think we have come to the end of recycling this evening. Some very great information. Thank you guys so much. Very great questions, and we certainly have more answers that we're going to be looking for down the road. With that, we're going to move on to number 10. And our library director has been in the on-deck circle for quite a while. Thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you. Mayor Sitma and Council, I'm here to hopefully quickly let you know what's going on at the library and to officially submit the Minot Public Library's 2018 annual report. In May, I provided some information regarding the expenses and the value of the Minot Public Library. So this presentation includes some updates for 2018. The first few slides are a lot of numbers. Essentially, what it gets down to is that the library provides over $7 million worth of value to the citizens. And that comes down to about $5.19 of value for every dollar we spent. Homeowners with homes valued at $182,000 pay approximately $50 for the library, which means they're paying for $154.27 of services per person. And when we talk about that, we're talking about lots of different services, everything from reference questions and gaming to story times, DVDs, CDs, our homebound delivery, and of course, books. How that's all figured out is through a very intricate return on investment calculator, which I won't get into too much, but I wanted to share that on Friday I asked our Facebook followers to share with me why they love our library. And in a matter of hours, I received very many wonderful compliments about the library, how we are a vital resource, we offer a free, safe place, a great place for books and entertainment. We also heard that we're a staple to the community, tons of resources, great, wonderful things. But there's more. So as a library director, I feel like it's kind of my job, especially this year, to dispel some myths. So if we're talking in library terms, that means I'm going to be circulating some nonfiction instead of fiction. So one of the common myths I get, and some of this I even heard on our Facebook post, is that libraries are just for kids. That's not true. We love the children who come to our library, and this morning I had the pleasure of hosting story time for our children's librarian, but we offer services to everyone in our community. Services including our new tool library, our 3D printer, our online classes. We have a variety of digital resources, including Pronunciator, where you can learn a new language online. We have historical presentations, meeting rooms, and of course our great makerspace, where even adults enjoy the green screen in our makerspace. Another myth that I commonly hear is that libraries are quiet. It's not true. We can be quiet. However, libraries are places where people gather, they learn and create, and that's not always quiet. Children at story times, teens using the makerspace, and adults using meeting rooms are not quiet. One of the most popular programs we had in 2018 was Anything But Quiet, as Soulshine rocked the library after hours. Some other myths that I hear is that the library is all about books. I hope that you all know that that is not true, that books are important and education is important, but we need to meet the demands of the population, and people want more. That goes along with the next thing, that in today's modern era, libraries are less important, which is even more untrue. Libraries offer people a place to find resources and information to open small businesses. We reach out to the engineers of our future, and we help provide classes for people. Another thing that I sometimes hear from people in the community is that they don't want to return to the library because they have a fine or they've never returned an item. I'm not looking at anyone in particular. That's not true. We want you back. We want everyone back. So just a little hint of what's coming soon, and I think this follows well on the talk of recycling, is that next week, along with the environmentally minded people of Minot, we'll be hosting a discussion on climate change. Following that, we have our annual Dr. Seuss birthday celebration, where hundreds of parents and kids come to the library on a Sunday afternoon to celebrate Dr. Seuss's birthday. Later in March, we have a Harry Potter-inspired escape room. We're going to be partnering with 2 organizations in April to host poetry events throughout the summer, or throughout April, and then in the summer, we'll kick off our summer reading program with more than 100 programs for all ages in basically 2 months. And even more exciting, coming this spring and summer, we're going to have a circulating board game collection to add to our non-traditional unique collections. A few challenges I just want to make sure that you're aware of is, of course, everyone knows we've been in talks with the Library Merger Committee. So one of the biggest challenges we face this year, and one of my main goals, is to wrap this up one way or the other. And we will be talking about this at the next City Council meeting. But we really want to make sure that what we're doing is what's best for the people of Minot and Ward County. We also have a building that's had no major improvements since 1966 to the outside, so that's something that we're hoping to be able to do more in 2020. And then the biggest and most important thing, and what I would ask all of City Council and all of the citizens to do, is to help me promote why libraries are important and why this is something that everyone should appreciate and value. And with that, that's all I have.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
Any questions for our librarian? Alderman Patrugula.
Just a comment. I finally used your tool library, and that was a very positive experience. I saved myself a lot of money, and I wanted to make sure that members of the public knew that. They have lots of nifty tools that some of us who aren't all that handy might not, be economical for us to buy. But it was a very, very pleasant experience. So thank you for having that tool library.
Thank you, Alderman Patrugula.
I thought you said you weren't going to talk. Oh, okay. Alderman Walsky.
So thank you, Janet, for the wonderful presentation, for the work you guys do over there. I want to add what will no doubt be considered sort of a goofy idea into the equation, but I read an article just the other day that some communities and cities are, in a sense, combining or at least integrating in many forms their city clerk's office with their libraries. As a institution that is, in my opinion, a place where I think I could easily describe it as you guys the keepers of the information. There is so much information in the clerk's office that I think is valuable to citizens and that they request access to, whether this is ordinances or minutes or past actions. I just think there's an interesting two departments that might be able to find some added value for citizens if we can find a way to integrate some of that information. So I just wanted to share that thought. I am not going to propose this at any upcoming meeting.
Further questions for Janet? Thank you, Janet. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that takes us over to our liaison reports, and I think it only proper that we start with Alderman Olson tonight, seeing as we just finished up with the library, and she may have something to do with that.
Well, briefly, because Janet did already touch on it, but I do chair the Library Merger Committee, and we've been meeting for several months. We are ready to make a recommendation to the Minot City Council and to the Ward County Commission. As Janet said, it'll come up on our next agenda. A recommendation to pursue this, because it looks like the information that we have shows that we can increase services and save money, and I think that that's probably what most people are in favor of. So we are going to look for further guidance from both the council and the commission, and look forward to continuing to work on it.
And thank you, Alderman Olson, for your work on that. Alderman Walsky.
Sure, Mayor, thank you. The Commission on Aging, regular monthly meetings with them of primary business coming up. Many of you have probably got invitations, but March for Meals on March 12th, a very significant service that organization delivers into our community, and they're very proud of telling that story. That's one of their I think, most significant days of the year in terms of sharing what they do, and for members of the community to learn about what's going on down there as well. Planning and zoning, we touched on that tonight. You guys know exactly where that steering committee is at. Renaissance Zone, been meeting monthly, had a great application that we approved last month. We are also, I think, getting very close to having a draft of our Renaissance Zone development plan, which is kind of a review of our updated guiding document, and I'm hopeful that board will be considering or at least starting to look at and develop comments shortly. Perhaps in the next month or two, we'll have a draft here to consider.
Thank you, Alderman Walsky. Alderman Janser.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So with the restructuring of the MADC board, I retired from that role. The the liaison committee and the community development committee and the pension board have not met. I do anticipate additional time commitment going to the City Hall project, which we hope to get moving on shortly once HUD gives us the go-ahead. So that will be upcoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Janser and Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. The Rec Commission, some of the startup of spring programs, advertising. Obviously, the big item there is the merger between the Parks Department and the Recs Department. Moving along, the vehicle to allow that merger to take place this year is moving through the legislative body down in Bismarck. It was approved on one side, and the Parks Department and the Rec Department are already commingling resources as far as people and advertising certain programs together, and I think they're both seeing the benefit of the collaborative effort. I know that some of the graphic design tools and asset that the Parks Department have paid big dividends already on the rec side of the equation. I know they're excited about having those resources available. So moving along.
Thank you, Alderman Pittner and Alderman Pattagula.
Thank you. I've not, none of the groups I'm formally assigned to has met in the interim. Instead, I've been spending my time on Lisa's library committee and can vouch for the extreme not extreme, but great thoroughness they've looked at their task with, and also on Josh's zoning committee, zoning, rezoning, building standards kind of thing. And they also worked very, very hard. So whatever recommendations come from those two bodies, I will be strongly supporting and backstopping the presentations of the other people who are assigned there formally.
Thank you, Alderman Pattagula. And as I sit on MADC's board, I would like to go into great detail on that. However, I cannot. At least hopefully sometime soon down the road that we'll hear many great things from them. And then also sitting on Task Force 21, I haven't had any trips, but Alderman Janser could probably fill us in for a good 45 minutes. However, he's given that presentation twice in 2 days, so I will spare him that, only that we're diligently watching some things that are going on down at the state legislature and also activities around the country regarding our retention of Mounted Air Force Base, doing some very good work there as well. That moves us on to number 12. Any miscellaneous or other discussion items this evening? Alderman Walski.
I know we're all anxious to get out of here, but I want to introduce two things tonight. One, following our last significant snow event a couple weeks ago, the one that dropped 10 to 12 inches in town, I thought the city had just an excellent response to that event. I was greatly pleased with how quickly roads were open, how quickly residential neighborhoods were opened up. But I did have I witnessed one event that gave me cause for concern. Mr. Mayor, you got an email from me as well as our Public Works Director. But one of those, I think it was the Tuesday morning, so maybe the day after our Monday meeting, I was on the Broadway Bridge very early in the morning, and we were still early in our response. We had probably not even got out of our snow emergency routes at that particular time. But the Broadway Bridge pedestrian area was so impacted by snow that we had a pedestrian actually in the street, traveling in the traffic lane. And so what I reached out to with to our mayor and to our Public Works Director was an idea that I think can be perhaps considered by us as a council in terms of a revision to our snow removal response plan, which would be, and I'm just going to outline it briefly. I'm going to work with staff over the next week or so to draw this up so we can formally consider it, but would be the addition of a classification in our plan of arterial pedestrian. This would be pedestrian infrastructure that is essentially critical in terms of connecting different areas of town. And right now, the only obvious one that I would have identified would be the Broadway Bridge. And by creating that classification of arterial pedestrian, we can then add that to a priority list in a space where we can get to it at the same point as maybe we start to head into residential neighborhoods. All of these things would be questions for us to consider in terms of evaluating any revisions to the plan. But the circumstance that I observed that morning was alarming enough that I think there might be some attention to the plan that's deserving. As a second issue, I've taken 2 calls this week related to the U.S. Postal Service. I know that this is not something we actually have control over, but the second call was significant enough because the story that was told, and this is firsthand, was a certified mail that did not get delivered. And was essentially lost in the system, and it was and so when I hear a story like that, and I get another call, and obviously the weather's been a real challenge for the post office, we know that it's been a challenge for everybody. But when I start hearing stories about certified mail that is getting lost in the system, it becomes alarming to me from a city perspective, because we send out a lot of certified mail notifications related to planning and zoning. So I bring this issue up because I wonder if it's reaching a point where we should at least consider a resolution and request our federal delegation sort of look into the issue in terms of what's going on here locally. I've heard so many anecdotal stories over the past year that we have an issue, and I just wanted to introduce that topic tonight as something that I think we should possibly consider in the future.
Thank you, Alderman Wolski. And if memory serves correct, we had at that point Senator Heitkamp and even Senator Hoeven that a number of years ago visited after we lost our sorting facility, dealing with the rural response to mail, and even within Minot. I too have actually had many phone calls, and I'm not expecting the chief to come up here, but dealing with theft, dealing with a group of folks that were stealing checks. And is my understanding is a couple of individuals have actually reached out to the Postmaster General because of lack of response and other things. So it's certainly something that we can talk about further and look into within our community, because it is something that impacts every single one of us. And seeing as we're hearing more and more of it, certainly something, a resolution or action, at least on this body, asking for a look certainly wouldn't hurt at this point. The only other aspect that I ask in regard to the snow removal is that as we consider any possibility of changes, is that we also take a look at what those changes would do to impact of response time, seeing as I too agree that the response from the last major snow event was as good as I've seen it, and any potential impact to that and or cost. Alderman Olson.
Mayor Sitma, I, along with several women in the community, are going to be wearing the same black dress for 5 days next week. So I just encourage everyone to kind of look at Facebook pages and watch in the media as several of us join the Little Black Dress campaign, wearing the same black dress for 5 days in order to raise money for Bio Girls and other women's projects within the city of Minot.
Absolutely, we will look for that. Thank you, Alderman Olson. Any further discussion items before we adjourn tonight? Alderman Janser.
I move we adjourn. Second.
Motion by Janser, second by Alderman Pittner. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.